Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Ankur Chara, Senior Solutions Manager for Forcepoint. Joining me today's Tech Talk is Chris Porter, Sales Engineer for Forcepoint. In this presentation, we will go over best practices for data protection when the majority of workforce goes remote. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. Today's Tech Talk is being recorded. You'll be able to revisit this link for that recording after the event is complete. Also, we invite your comments and questions. Please look at the Q&A chat box on your screen. If you think of a question for me at any point, just type it in there and we will hold it for the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. At this time, we'll begin the presentation. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things which we are hearing from many of our customers and other security practitioners is, does your data protection strategy hold in the new realities? And that is a fair question because organizations have implemented data protection policies after careful deliberation, but now that those things were put in place with a certain expectation in mind of where are people usually working from, what percentage of people are working remote versus what percentage of people are working from within corporate environment, that has completely changed. And that's why we get these questions like, hey, does my data protection strategy still hold? And that's why we have like, is my strategy relevant? And the next follow-up is, what do we change? Do I need to change something based on what has been put in place? So with that in mind, let's look at what are the main pillars which go into your data protection strategy. Let's go to the next slide. And so we look at the pillars for your data protection strategy. The first and foremost, which we are looking at here, is endpoints. Which endpoints are we allowing to access the corporate data? So that is one of the things which you have to consider when you're putting a data protection strategy together. Then next one is you have to look at policies. And you need to have unified policies which cover both on-premises and cloud data, not just one or the other. Yes, in new realities, the percentage of what are being accessed will get altered and will get changed, but it still holds in terms of if you have unified policies. And another aspect to look at when you're putting a strategy together is risk. How do I leverage risk to make automated policy decisions to allow access to data? And this risk can be very valuable when you're looking at policies which change dynamically as well. So that becomes a key point. So if your data protection strategy was following these pillars, then it will still hold true for most part. Yes, there might be some adjustments that we'll have to make depending on the new realities, and that's what we are going to go into in this rest of the Tech Talk.
Yeah, thank you, Ankur. And so like what Ankur was saying, we're dealing with a change situation right now, and that there is definitely going to be changes need to be made, especially as users are working from home more, or at least in a remote section where we no longer have them in the office, or we're, more of a remote workspace. Now, if your organization has already moved more towards that, then you will be more familiar with these rule sets. But there are definitely some things that we can change within the DLP side of things, or at least the way that our DLP is set up, to make sure that we're able to still provide that full protection, make sure that our endpoints are still going to be compliant with the rule sets there. And one of the biggest ones with this is the endpoint connectivity. For those of you who don't know, the endpoint does need to talk back to the manager to be able to pull updated policies, as well as report back the information that it sees as users, violate these policy rule sets here. And when the users are not VPN'd in or not connected, and if you don't force VPN, then that endpoint doesn't have a way to communicate back. And so we actually do have a couple of ways that we can help with that. Like I said, the most common one currently right now is probably the VPN, just because, hey, users used a VPN or they came into the office. So we didn't have to deal with this situation where weeks or months at a time Someone may not come into the office or may not VPN in on there. And so the first option that we have to ability to do this is allowing you to put an endpoint server in the DMZ. This is a forwarded server. You just post it or you put it in the DMZ. You tell the endpoints, you put an update saying here's where that host name is. And the endpoint's going to reach out over port 443. It's a secure connection and be able to update policies as well as update the servers. So also is useful because you're not exposing your primary management server to the actual internet, right? It's all going to be behind the actual firewall there. And the other option, especially now as we deal with the more cloud-based industry, is putting a update server in AWS or Azure. Now, if you already have your full infrastructure in AWS or Azure, then what we need to do is just make sure that the endpoints are aware of where that is and can forward. If not, or if this is something that you're just exploring, will you do the same thing as you would install in the DMZ, or same thing as making a supplemental server. You install that server in AWS, in Azure, make sure that the endpoints are aware of where that server's name is. You have to make it publicly reachable. Again, over port 443, it's going to be secured. There's certificate communication to make sure that not anybody's going to be able to connect to it. And that's going to allow your endpoints to securely update. And what this does is it facilitates the changes of the world right now with us all working remote and make sure that everybody is still going to be secure. The other thing that we might want to look at changing is around screenshots. Now, normally when users are inside the office, we don't necessarily care. They're allowed to take screenshots and other actions there. However, with everybody working from home, we have less network controls potentially dependent on what's actually in place. And one of the things that we can do to help with that is preventing users from using the print screen function on their machine. So this allows us to go into the endpoint settings here. We can change the endpoint applications to say what action do we want to take place when a user tries to use the screenshot when that application is running. You see, we can change it down. You can select whatever applications you want. We have several pre-built. You also can add your own. And then you decide, do you want to permit? Do you want to just audit that? Or do you want to block them from doing a screenshot? All of those options will show up in the recording or in the reporting as we go through and look at that, right? And now we have a couple other changes that we want to go over within the manager itself, just dealing with the current situation. So I'm going to switch over to my manager screen here. And on the manager screen, we're going to go through and investigate some of the policies. And now these policies are what we're going to utilize to identify, what data is going on. All of you should be familiar with, what's going on, how these things do. But the one thing that we want to go over is how our current policies are set up and how we need to change the policies to deal with this. So a lot of these policies might rely on network controls, being able to block over the network web and email. And depending on the rule sets that you have in place, especially with network controls, OCR may no longer be a feature that is available for users who are remote. And so creating a policy, either creating a new policy to block images or creating custom policies or changing your rule sets to allow image uploads. So in this case here, we're going to call it image block. Oh, if I can type, we do it right. So we're going to call it image blocking. And then what we're going to do with this policy is we're going to go in and create a file type condition. This file type condition is going to allow us to block based on the fact that image files are being uploaded. So we'll come under our file properties rule set. Within the file properties rule set, this is specifically looking at the exact file type. And we want to go down under here, we go under various image formats. And we have all of these different file types. Now, if you only want to block certain ones or other upload types on here, we absolutely can go through on that. You see we have various different ones that we're looking at. So we do various graphics formats, which is going to block image files. And then we're going to go through to the severity in action and make sure that the action plan is set to block all. And when we edit this block all action, we're specifically looking at the endpoint action here. Now, depending on your rule sets and your needs, we can bypass by source and destination to make sure that this policy applies to the appropriate users. And what this is going to do is allow us to make sure that the policies that we're utilizing are actually focused correctly on where we need them to be, right? So this is actually going to give us the information in the correct rule sets to say, I want to prevent users from moving images around. LAN can also be especially important because it's no longer your network LAN that they're dealing with. This LAN is now their personal networks, right? So we want to make sure that that channel that is off by default is actually enabled. There are a couple ways to mass change this. Once we put this in, we'll finish this policy, and now we have this policy that is set to block images. The other rule set is that if you have policies that are set only for the network channel, we need to make sure that those policies are still in place and those are still going to function. Keep in mind, network email, because our servers are still in the Exchange relay, will still be in place. But if we are no longer looking at this, or we no longer have these policies for the web side of things, so right here, this policy is only set to look for the network web, we need to make sure to update those channels to monitor for the endpoint HTTP and HTTPS sections.
That's interesting, Chris, because one of the things which I hear on a regular basis as well is like, hey, how does my policy get impacted, and what are the channels which I might have to either add or subtract? Because at times, let's say we are looking at the office printer. Now the office is shut down. The office printer is, that policy might not even be required, and things might be changed or adjusted in the way work is being done today. So
Exactly. And that's another thing there. Is if you have whitelisted rules where exceptions were in place for that, for printers or for USB devices, again, we have less controls right now, or we have less visibility. Not everybody's in the office. We don't have your printers for the recording. So we need to make sure that your policies that we're whitelisting were not a general whitelist. You need to make them a specific whitelist, probably based on an AD group or a domain group. Or the actual, FQDN of the printers, to make sure that they're whitelisted so users can't print sensitive data at home. That is be very important for certain compliance standards, depending on what you fall under. And then speaking of, data that users may have at home, we want to talk a little bit about discovery as well. With the change of this, we no longer are dealing with, users downloading data and putting that back on the machine. We're also dealing with potential for them to store data on there. Again, some of you may be familiar with this already, but if you're not, the endpoint does have the ability to discover locally on its own machine what data is stored there. And this can reside or be found in the form dependent on the policies here. So we have several different policies that we're utilizing for this information. These can be custom policies. These also can be predefined policies, the same way that we have with the active policy sets. And then once we have these policies in place, we actually need to go and create an endpoint discovery task. And this allows us to tell the endpoint we want to find data that is stored on the endpoint itself. So let's say if we deal with PCI or SSNs, we can come under here and say, I want to find PCI and SSN data. And then with this policy, as with all of our sections, you can decide who this is going to apply to. So maybe not all of your users deal with sensitive data, but everybody's got an HR. And even sometimes when you are, hiring people, or as things change with the organization, you need to make sure that your HR, who's still working from home, isn't storing or trying to keep sensitive data or even sensitive employee data on their machines. So we can edit this to target specific ones. We can have this policy run at a specific set of time as well. So it doesn't have to just run once. We can run this daily at certain points in the day. We can have it run weekly, and then you can, either select all or select specific hour blocks or specific day blocks, depending on what exactly you're looking for when your users deal with this. And then we also can do a continuous scan. Keep in mind, this isn't always required, especially with the amount of data that users may be dealing with, but it can be useful to identify the information that is stored and as users continuously edit it. Then you can go and select the policies. So right here, what we want to find is we want to look for USPII and PCI information, because it's going to find the relevant data for what we've called this policy set. Can filter out destinations and file types by age. So if files are not going to be relevant or not going to be filtered by you, we absolutely can go through and say, I want to only find files that are older than this, or that are older than a certain period of time, or that have been modified within a recent period of time. And then we have the ability to decide when we're doing a full set, as well as to hide the fact that we've discovered the data. So depending on how transparent you want to be to the user, we can fully hide the fact that we are scanning from them. And then when we get here, we're going to hit finish. And then this is going to give us the overview. Same thing as adding a predefined policy. We'll finish the policy, and this is going to allow us to make sure that we are scanning for data that is stored on users' machines, and then being able to take the relevant actions against that. And finally, what we want to go over are some of the configuration settings for the endpoint. This is one that not a lot of people may understand, that you can actually go and change how the endpoint functions on individual users' machines. And something that, especially when users are offline for longer periods of times, we may not need them to check for updates. Now, the first one that we have is the connectivity setting here, is how often do we want the endpoint to actually check for updates or configure it to ping back to the server. Typically, this is 5 minutes. These are all the default settings. Maybe you want to increase this to 60 minutes. So it just checks once an hour. If the user just changed network, so if they activate their VPN, it'll do an auto check. But this way that we're not spamming the internal network asking for it, or as you put servers in the DMZ or AWS, that we're not spamming those with large amounts. And the same thing for checking for actual policy updates. We also can increase this up to 24 hours. This does the same thing. It prevents us from overloading the connections right now, especially with everything being overloaded already. This makes it much easier for us. And the last one is, when should an endpoint be considered disconnected? If it receives no signal of any kind, when does it say, oh, something's wrong, something's not working? 48 is the default and 60 is the max. So we want to increase that out, and that gives us more fresh time. Now, if the endpoint does come back online after that time, it will still block, it'll still filter, and the users will be taken care of on that section there.
Yeah, that's good to know regarding the connectivity, because that's an interesting nuance in terms of, now that we have people, not in the usual workflow, and these are the usual, heartbeats that you typically have, which might benefit from being less often than what it used to be. So this definitely makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, and so that helps us there. And then the last thing that we really want to talk about on this is the disk space on the machines, where some of these may have been enough for it, and for the most part, these are going to be. But just keep in mind that we can actually change the log sizes that we're actually going to keep on the individual user machines. An average incident, from what I've seen, is a couple of kilobytes, maybe a couple hundred depending on the size. So these should be good for the defaults, especially if you do those connectivity options. But just be aware that these do exist, and they can help with your users and help make sure that we are actually keeping everybody safe and keeping all of their data safe. With that, we do want to jump in and see if there are any other further questions for us. And Ankur, do we have any questions?
Uh, Thank you, Chris. So that concludes today's Tech Talk presentation portion. We have several questions that have been submitted by the audience. As a reminder, if you have a question that you have not yet submitted, please enter it in the Q&A chat box, and we will get through as many questions as time allows. So at this time, Chris and I will begin the Q&A portion. Chris, the first question is for you. What is the most common endpoint connectivity solution people go for out of the three that you shared?
So currently, the most common one that I see users or being utilized is going to be VPN. However, like with the current setup or with the current situation, VPN tunnels are getting overloaded right now. And so what we can do with that, and then the most common solution to that, is actually going to be the AWS or Azure deployment. It's very easy to have high availability and setups there, followed by the DMZ. So my recommendation, especially now, is to go look at the AWS Azure setups for the best connectivity.
Thank you for that. And that definitely makes sense, because VPN is what many people have already put in place, and they are looking at the capacity of it right now, because we do see that it's getting pegged for many of the organizations, but it's an infrastructure which is already in place. So it kind of makes sense that people mostly are going with VPN first, and then see, like, okay, if they're starting to come to the capacity of it, that's when they start exploring other options like AWS. Another question is it possible to bypass a DLP on endpoint? And a follow-up is it recommended?
So yes, it is absolutely possible to bypass that. There are controls that are in place on the endpoint to prevent just anybody from bypassing. It does require access to the manager, and there's a unique code that is generated every time a bypass is requested. You enter that in the manager and decide how long you want the endpoint to bypass for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes, for 24 hours, or until a certain date and time. Both of those are, or all of those are specified in the console. Whether it's recommended or not will depend on the types of controls that you have in your organization. If this is something that we need to allow users to do on a consistent basis, I actually recommend creating an audit-only policy so that we still have the tracking of where that data is going, but we absolutely can do that in an emergency. Something needs to go out to a partner, an order needs to be sent right now. We absolutely can bypass that.
That's a good way to put it, because one of the things which I've also seen is like, there might be some excruciating circumstances. Yes, in that case, you can leverage something like that. But also, if you are leveraging it for too long or for not the right reasons, then it might, have an impact on the security posture. So, yeah, having an audit-only policy instead might actually make sense. So. Uh, all right, so another question we have is, can you whitelist specific channels and group of people?
Absolutely. So in every policy, we have the ability to decide who the policy applies to and what channels it's applying to, and then what specific destinations within those channels. So if you have, say, a corporate SharePoint, or you have a exact printer that you want to use where you want to bypass other ones, we can add all of those in and apply it, as well as the same thing with the AD groups. We can say that certain users are only allowed to access certain data or send certain data to certain destinations, whereas everyone else is blocked. And the idea behind that is to make sure that your security posture isn't compromised. We're still protecting your data, but your users are still able to perform their job function and their workload.
That's good to know. And yeah, as you said, one of the things is because we have whitelist solution for specific channels and the way they are being leveraged might get altered. So you'll have to just make sure that it is up to date, because as you said, some of those things which in the past were being used more are probably being used less now, and some things which were being used less are being used more. For example, like the printer function versus, USB as a channel versus cloud applications or cloud, storage as a channel. Those things might get impacted based on the way our workflows have changed. I've
Exactly.
seen personally as well, like the amount of, cloud data which is being leveraged has definitely increased, and that kind of makes sense. And some of the other things have reduced. So yes, we'll have to keep that in mind when we are looking at specific channels and also group of people. And one of the other things which I would like to also add is regarding the risk, because in one of the screens which Chris was showing, we looked at a risk. It can be a factor in how we have the policies implemented. So if you have analytics as a part of the solution for your data protection, then you can have a risk score tied to every user. And based on the user's risk score, you can have different policies or different actions that can be allowed for the user. So why is that important? Because many times when we were having discussions with our uh, you know uh, you know security practitioners, they were like, hey, I worry that if I make any policy a little too restrictive, it will come in the business productivity workflow and it will not get received well, and then I'll have to either undo it or find alternatives. That's why they end up getting stuck in audit only mode. What risk allows us to do is we can say, hey, guess what? You have different risk, scores for different people. As soon as it is super high risk, we can do something with, blocking certain actions or functions, or, completely locking down somebody. Versus when they are low risk or medium risk, allow them to do everything, or, you can then graduate it, starting from, allowing everything, then maybe start doing audit, and then you start doing like drop email attachments, and then you go into block everything. So there's like a band of actions which you can take. Why does that help? Is because when I know that majority of my users are going to be in the low risk bucket, everybody is going to be productive and they'll be able to do their day-to-day job without any resistance. While if as soon as something happens where the risk score just goes through the roof, it will actually block things from going out. So before something gets exfiltrated, it will be actually much more uh, value that I get out of the solution rather than just being stuck in audit only, and then you're having an exercise in forensics and investigation rather than actual blocking, utilizing the tools that you have. So uh, that's where the risk aspect comes in handy. So I've seen that also benefit a lot of security practitioners to go beyond the audit only function by leveraging risk.
Exactly. Yep.
So with that, we come to the end of the Q&A section because of time. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for the Tech Talk. If you have any additional questions or would like to connect directly with the Forcepoint team, you can either reach out to us directly with the contact information on the slide, or you can reach out to your account manager. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.